Brilliant. So Joanne, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so Maurice, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really grateful. And you're a very interesting man. So it would just be really good to hear a little bit more about you. So could you just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and also a little bit about Blue Labour and what that is and your vision for that?
Oh, okay. So really, hi everybody, and I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope it's not a waste of time. So I'm Maurice. I'm in Stoke Newington in sort of northeast London. As you can see, I smoke. I'm married with 3 children, and it's been a very difficult lockdown. That's what I wanted to share with you. First of all, incredibly long, and I've got an overwhelming sense of simultaneously anxiety and boredom, and they're fighting inside of me. So it's really lovely to be able to speak to some people. In terms of Blue Labour, it was sort of the financial crash. I think for a lot of you, an event from your childhood, 2008, and for me it was just the end of a road. And sort of we put everything on finance in the City of London. This is Labour I'm talking about. Labour here completely accepted globalization and financial capitalism, and everything was put on the state, and then it all just disintegrated. And I was, where I'm from a Jewish background, so that everybody knows, but a dead tribe. It's the Jewish working class. There used to be a lot of us, but not so much anymore. And I just watched my family go from being really strong Labour supporters to actually hostile, really hostile in a way, and just losing working class affections, losing working class sympathies. And then I worked for many years, 10 years or more, with what was originally called the East London Communities Organisation, which was called Telco. And then that turned into London Citizens. It's now Citizens UK. The campaign I was really involved with was living wage. That was very strong for me. And also we had an anti-usury campaign. In the crash, you know, the banks were borrowing at 3% and the poor were borrowing at 5,000%. That really got my goat for, you know, quite a few years. And through that, I worked a lot. It's got to be said, at that time, overwhelmingly with the Catholic churches were involved in community organising, but with a broad range of Christian groups, Christian denominations, as we're calling them, with the East London Mosque predominantly, but other Muslim groups. And I did my PhD in Italy, and there I discovered Catholic social thought. So Catholic social thought to me is a really fundamental thing. The idea that we're fallen, that sin is real in the world, and that you have to resist it in various ways through incentives to virtue rather than incentives to vice. And the 4 pillars really informed Blue Labour. In a way, Blue Labour was Catholic social thought trying to disguise itself in the world. So the 4 pillars were the dignity of labour, the work should be respected, and workers. The second aspect of that was a terrible word, but it's called subsidiarity, but it actually means that power should be exercised at the most local level possible. That society should be organised on the basis of solidarity. That's an active relationship, political relationship where you share a fate. And then the 4th component was stewardship, the idea that so human beings and nature are not commodities. That's why that was the whole thing. So in many ways, the engagement with community organising added the complement of political action to the Catholic social thought, and then I realised that when I spoke about love, or spoke about family, or spoke about work, or spoke about, you know, patriotism as a form of solidarity, I got told by my class, by my friends, that these were essentially right-wing things. these were right-wing ideas. Left-wing ideas were justice, equality, inclusivity, diversity. These were the words of the time. And then also, as I've shared with you about lockdown, I was extremely concerned that everybody was supposed to be happy all the time, and sadness had been removed utterly from the human equation, when I think that, you know, if I give you my life, I would say it's a 70-30 split towards melancholia. So blue Labour was a statement about that it's okay to be blue, and that you didn't need then to be have psychiatric or psychological testings or go on antidepressant drugs. That friendship, love is redemptive in these matters. And then my mum died, just at everybody. So my mum died exactly just at the peak of the crash. And so I was having a conversation with my wife, and I said, I'm feeling really blue, and Labour's lost it, and Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. So Blue Labour was born. I didn't expect anything to happen. It was just a small group of us, but it kind of caught on, and in a kind of manic way. And within 6 months, I ended up in the House of Lords. So that's how it goes. So that's a very rough story of the birth journey.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing so much, and there's a lot there that I'm sure we'll be pondering on. I'm just wondering, could you also maybe just share a little bit about the Common Good Foundation and what that is for us as well?
Yeah, so deep down in the mix of Blue Labour is the idea of the reconciliation of interests. This is deep in organising, it's deep in Catholic social thought, it's deep in Labour, which is that estranged interests, so capital and Labour, immigrants and locals, north and south. Welcome, Florence from Derbyshire. I know that you don't know. Would you consider yourself north? Yeah. It's the River Trent, isn't it, that decides the matter. And that what we had was a politics that couldn't even conceive of a reconciliation of these things. Either it was a endless class hate or race war or gender war, or and so the common good, the active reconciliation and recognition of differences and recognitions of conflict, was always at the deep heart of it. And when I realised that this was going to be a long journey, I set up the Common Good Foundation in order to explore the politics of the common good. That was it. So when you think about Blue Labour, that's what it is. My eldest son says that Blue Labour is the paramilitary wing, and the Common Good Foundation is the legal arm. They're very connected in that way. And that's also, great. Just to add or throw in that obviously radicalism and conservatism. I'm both conservative and radical in those ways.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I love the analogy there, the paramilitary wings. Thank you. And maybe just last of all, could you just say a little bit about how you came to get to know Together for the Common Good?
Yeah, well, Jenny Sinclair. So I was talking a lot about the common good, and Jenny contacted me, and I was really, I know that you're good people, so I won't swear. So let's just say I was a bit of a prat. A lot of people were trying to contact me. A lot of people were using the concept of the common good in quite a left-wing way. And I was thinking, well, the hard issues are to broker, relationships between different interests. So, the joke I always make, Adam, this is what the joke I make to constituency Labour parties. It's the last thing you want to hear when you go to the doctor. It's progressive. Okay, so this is one. And basically, Jenny was really insistent, and I thought, I didn't know who she was, but then we met, and Jenny and I have been, on the journey ever since. She's a tremendous friend, and the thing that you were sent, The Plague in the Parish, wrote that together with her. You know, Jenny is part of my life. You know, that's how it is. We've known each other. It's been 10 years now since we met, so I can't really imagine life without her in lots of ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks. It's really eye-opening just to get to know you a bit more. And then could you just kind of start opening up the discussion a bit more about the plague and the parish, and you know, the document that you wrote and your kind of vision and ideas behind that, and then we can go in maybe to some interactive discussion after.
Yeah, certainly. So, but basically anybody, and I'm only looking at half of you because I'm on my iPad, so I'm going to switch screens and say hi to everybody here as well. Interrupt any time. I mean, just if you've got any questions. So we've got the COVID, and so being involved in politics, I was involved in lots of different conversations about post-COVID world, which in a way followed completely from post-Brexit world. You know, these were, we've just come out of one trauma only to enter into another. And what I noticed in all these conversations that I was having in politics is that no one mentioned the church ever. You know, it was, you know, what's the state going to do? What needs to be done in the economy? What about welfare? But in any conception, the church was missing, and so I had a sort of analysis. You know, Pope Francis, I put it in the piece, said it's just a phrase that really got me thinking. He said that we're not living through an era of change, but a change of era. So what's the new era? The new era certainly involves, I'm saying to you certainly, but you're completely free to argue. As far as I'm concerned, I'm working on the assumption that the new era has a much stronger, that we're moving from the era of globalization into something else. So we've had 40 years where basically go to university, get a degree, join the knowledge economy, you know, that's the pathway. And workers have been invisible, and place has been invisible, and the nation state was supposed to be basically an administrative centre for global capital. That's a rough summary. I could be more nuanced, but you know, I'm aware in life that we can run out of time. So what was shocking about Brexit was that the nation state was back, right? That's the first thing. And politics was back. Suddenly it mattered. I'm not saying, Adam, that it didn't matter if Ed Miliband or David Cameron were elected Prime Minister. I'm just saying the world wouldn't have really changed that much. You know, we've had eras of that. And suddenly politics was dangerous and politics was real. And so part of that is about the nation state. The second, for me, equally, if not more significant feature of the new era was that the working class were back. This was extraordinary. They were the left behind, they were the woe begone, they were the relics. You know, on the left we had some pity, but we really hated them actually. But we had some pity and thought there should be some projects and some theatres and maybe some bicycle lanes in ex-mining villages. But they weren't finished. They weren't finished at all. So we saw that with the Brexit referendum. That was I viewed that very much in terms of class. And then we had it again last December. It was a leaving of Labour, a really strong abandonment of Labour. So Labour's middle class vote went up really significantly. Labour's now the party of the middle class and the wealthy. You know, this is what I've witnessed in my years. So you wonder why I'm blue. And so the working class are back and asserting themselves in all manner of strange ways. And the third thing was that, you know, it was supposed to not matter where you lived as long as you had an internet connection and access to a library. But it turned out the place was very important, and that whole class and place thing is very important in my mind. So we've got the new era. In my era is, let's just say, a more significant role for the state, and we're seeing that all the time in terms of economics, and in terms of obviously response to the virus. Working class are back, places back. That's key. These kind of secular trends. But then, where's the church? Where does the church fit in to this new era? And Jenny was the one who was willing to have the conversation. And I worked with other people called the Church Missional Society. You know, it's a magazine. A guy called Alan Roxburgh, another guy called Martin Robinson, who's in Birmingham, and Sarah Jane Roxburgh, they're in Canada. And so that conversation, and we talked it through. It was a really long, sometimes felt like eternal Zoom conversation that went on for several weeks, twice a week, until we got to the plague in the parish, you know, and the essential elements of the plague and the parish really is that, first of all, that what was mundane, what was desecrated, will become resacralized. So that's menial work. Do you remember before the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a national sentiment about respect for work, respect for key workers, you know, bus drivers, shelf stackers, cleaners. You know, it wasn't just an NHS thing. There was an understanding, so new definition of working class, something you can't do from home, you know, so you have to leave the house and do something for somebody else, usually with your hands. But also the places that they lived suddenly became more vivid. People were locked down, they were at home, you know, and suddenly food, neighbours, it was a quite intense experience while it lasted. And then this idea of the church has to move from being host to neighbour, that the church shares the fate of its neighbours, i.e. that they can be completely disregarded, that the church can be completely ignored. It's vulnerable, it's really, really vulnerable, and needs to build, and this is the organising aspect, needs to build relationships with others. You know, that there's state power, which is administrative, there's market power, which is essentially the power of money to own creation itself, and the church is the bastion of a relational power. In other words, used to be called love, you know, and some form of civic friendship is embodied. So if that's the origins of the plague and the parish, is to try to conceptualize, and I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say. That was us trying to conceptualize what role does the church play in the new era. And it's the essential plot. It's lost the plot because it's still stuck in the era of globalization. It's still thinking about projects. It's still thinking about issues relating to funding streams. And it's when in fact what the church is fighting for its very existence in order to build support. So essentially it's got to move away from just giving and looking to be loved in return, you know, relational. Joanne, that's the crucial thing. So I see a huge amount of churches doing incredible things for poor people, broken people, abandoned people, but we've got to a stage where the people need to also reciprocate and build mutual relationships, and that was what we called the kingdom of God. That essentially after Corona's done, and we're going to see it now, the market is going to want to recoup its losses, and the state is there to administer the debris, but who is going to keep some notion of the sacred and of genuine, non-instrumental, non-using, non-administrative, you know, relationships alive? So a big part of this, just to drop it in, is we're moving to covenant, from contract to covenant. How do we bind ourselves to each other in solidarity in the places that we are. So solidarity, subsidiarity, how are the workers going to be respected in a genuine way when they're just commodified units, and how are we going to protect our natural environment and all this in the places that we live. So Joanne, that's where I'm just giving everybody a sense of where the plague in the parish it's just a reflection on the possibility of a future where society doesn't exist, the church doesn't exist, we all just exist on Zoom, we all get our kicks from Netflix, we get our stuff from Amazon, and there's no relationships at all. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, people are getting richer and richer, the society disintegrates. So it's the church as a civic institution which has as its absolutely fundamental end as a civic institution love, the protection of love in the world. That's it. And that's what I've always, as an outsider, looked to the church to uphold, is relationships based on, faithfulness, reciprocity, those values, and they're threatened. So the new era could be, I wrote a piece, Adam, this is more for you, in the New Statesman last Sunday about China. China represents a very real future. High tech, no freedom of association, no freedom of religion, totally isolated. It's Florence, when Florence worked for John Connors, we used to laugh about it, the prosthetic future, the accelerationists. It's happening, guys. So how do you build relationships, durable relationships based on love that can resist the domination of the rich and the powerful? That's a rough summary.
Wow, thank you. That's excellent. Thank you so much. I'm just keen now really to open the floor up to anybody who wants to bring in a question or a comment to Maurice. Please just feel free and we'll start from there. Thank you.
Don't make it an academic seminar. Say what you like. Hi, Florence.
I'm delighted you've got such a high opinion of the church. I'm afraid I don't. I think I've seen lots of churches be shaped by a culture that produces entertainment and hasn't produced entertainment.
Yeah.
And has sort of fallen into this model of the sermon as the product, belief as an outcome, certainty as an outcome, and outreach is a potential added extra, but not the main thing is the sermon and the learning and having the right answers. And so I think in a way lockdown has favoured that model because people can live stream wherever. They can go to Hillsong in the States, or and there's no need to go back to the same one again and again. And there's also been like this cult of celebrity around particular preachers. And I don't know if I have a question, but
I get it.
But so I know that some churches are really good at relationships, but I think some of them it'll be hard to get bums back on seats because it will have become I hope we're not all used to YouTubing church, but I think a lot of people will.
Yeah.
I wish I had an optimistic sentiment to end on, or an enlightening question.
That's right.
This is the blue guy you're talking to. You don't need optimism.
Exactly. Florence, you know that. Anybody else want to say something?
So I wonder whether I completely get and agree with Florence's point. I wonder if there's something in there on effectively churches and religion have become commercialized in their approach. So you see during lockdown, bishops kind of tweeting about Dominic Cummings rather than actually kind of trying to carve out a leadership role for themselves in how do we bring the church into this post-coronavirus debate and start building that kind of that covenant between people and communities. So do you think, I suppose my question is, do you think that, or how do you think the churches could be better and prepare themselves more for being that role as a kind of builder of community and covenant, when actually they've taken a commercial approach and they're almost like the Labour Party and hollowed out into that only for the middle class and the wealthy?
I've got an instinct for these things. I find them in their period of ultimate decline and join them. Yeah.
I think I do know where Florence is coming from, but I would offer a challenge to that, in that I think there are certain kinds of churches that are susceptible to that kind of commercialization, but I think others, and actually during the pandemic, have really come into their own in terms of the whole idea of particularly churches that maybe Anglican churches where they're thinking about their parish, and all the different churches that have been doing things around food bank deliveries or other things. And we had a particularly interesting experience during the lockdown, because all my community organising work's totally moved online, but actually we've had this experience of our church kind of coordinating this weekly Zoom call with 6 other churches, a mosque and a few schools, and a tenants association, and then which had been kind of a load of kind of practical things. So we got some money to give out tablets to local families that haven't got struggling to do home education, supporting a food bank at the mosque, a few different things like that. And then we ended up doing a listening campaign, and a few kind of actual sort of issues that we wanted to work with local politicians on came up. And we had an assembly 2 weeks ago that had about 110 people from Shadwell and East London, which is one ward. And there was such a, I've been to quite a lot of community organising assemblies before, but I've probably not been to one where there was such a kind of affection for the place and between the institutions. And I think it was because of the trust that church had from several years worth of doing stuff in the community and being active there. I know that's not every church, but I think there's also the whole parish structure, for example, the Anglican Church gives a kind of responsibility to the place, which might be a good antidote to this. But I do still fully take your point about lots of churches that are more of the former kind of model.
I think sorry, may I?
Great, please.
So it's just reflecting on what Florence and others have been saying. I think I do recognise that commercialisation. I think ultimately it kind of comes down to how we measure success, or how we measure, to put it in more churchy language, blessing, if you like. How do we quantify the blessing that we are to the community? I think pre-lockdown, there are some things I'd come across about how do we measure in a different way. So obviously, the economy is often built on GDP and growth, and others have started talking about, well, what is something, I can't remember his name, but a chap who came up with the idea of the Good Country Index, the idea that countries can be measured by how much of a contribution they make to the international community, and how well they treat each other and their own citizens. So it's how good a country is, not who's best, but how good they are in relation to other countries. And then in a sort of church setting, I've just sort of been reflecting on this recently in terms of kind of, I hear what Florence was saying about the outputs and the inputs and the sort of, this plus this equals a, strong, confident faith, who's, all this kind of things. But I was just thinking, and part of that is about sort of how do we quantify things like spiritual maturity and growth and that kind of thing. And I've just been thinking recently, and others may disagree, but our responsibility as Christians in our faith is not so much to kind of grow the fruit ourselves. It's so much just kind of to use Jesus, vine and the branches, to stay connected to him. He does the growing, and the church in society is, again, it sort of sees its success as how many projects it can complete or how many kind of funding bids it can win. But perhaps, to use the vine analogy, it's how many connections, what the quality of those connections, are they interested in people who are different from themselves in their local surroundings? So I see some great interfaith work in Coventry, for instance, and I'm involved in some of that, and it's just privileged to be part of, because that sense of the common good is very evident, and it takes a humility on some of the churches to partner with other faith colleagues. I think it's really healthy. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll begin a response, but it's just a facilitation of more questions, or in Florence's case, acute observations, let's say. So, certain things to say. One thing I didn't talk about too much in my little introductory stream of consciousness was about the parish. It's called The Plague and the Parish, and obviously my concern, Florence, was that the church would become a sort of administered and managerialized, and the parishes would disappear, and and it would float away like Labour from being embodied in community to disembodied, and a value system. That's the trend. So almost become theologized and cease to be part of what we call in this the body politic. That was a little bomb waiting to go off. So
that's, I guess, what I think about the emphasis on belief is it's about belief rather than incarnation, and you can have an idea anywhere. But
yeah. So this is definitely picking up on the incarnation. The embedded and embodied in the fallen world is a fundamental way of understanding that, and then it's really great to be with you here, but obviously it would be better if there was, to use a theological term, real physical presence. That's a real physical presence is my flirtation with Christian theology. So Florence, there's no, what I'm saying is that there is a future that is necessary and bare and like this. And it's the second point is that there's got to be a reflection on how bad the last 30 to 40 years have been in this regard. This is, place doesn't matter, people don't matter, projects matter, income stream matter, all these things. So it's a new chapter, and what I'm seeing in terms, what I'm saying when I say the church, I'm really talking about a very long book. The church has had many forms, and I view the church historically as a vital part of our body politic. That it's fundamentally through the parish, also through the role of the church in establishing a legal order in many different ways. I see the church as permeating so much that is good. So I take from a kind of long-term historical view, and what was causing me the existential horror was, where does that go? Where does all of that go? So the parishes can just disappear, the places can be abandoned. I could completely see, Fred, the church mirroring Labour with a concern primarily for the poorest and losing touch with working people, more ordinary people in their lives and in their sentiments. And we saw indications of that during Brexit. So, and then Tom, I'm many things to say, but just to say that it's a really horrible word, but I use the word commodified rather than commercialized. And the reason I use the word commodified is that this relentless pressure to turn everything into a commodity. It's a kind of process. So commercialization almost indicates like selling out, or, an indie band that gets a major record deal or something like that. But the situation's worse. it's trying to turn all assets into money. And then, so the way that I view capitalism is that it's this systematic attempt to turn creation itself, human beings and nature, into commodities that, that are bought and sold on labour markets, housing markets, food market. That's the pressure. So how do you preserve some integrity of creation? And Florence, that's also, I think the church really should have something to say about that one, as it moves, the integrity of the person and the integrity of creation and Fred, once again, the commodification is important, but I see it all the time, this stress on measurement, how do we evaluate? Whereas of course, the fundamental work is a daily act of resistance to an inhumanity that appears in both commercial and state relationships. I mean, I just raised to everybody care homes, right? We've just had the most incredible manifestation of this story where there's privately owned, state-regulated care homes and people were just abandoned to die without love. It's happened in these last 3 months. So obviously and this goes back to what I said before, when I look to the church, I look for some resistance to that, some preservation of human relationship in an increasingly inhumane world. And what's weird, Fred, is that I'm having these conversations. It's too boring to go into details, but like with the Bank of England, with the Treasury, with all of these institutions about post-COVID economics, and I'm desperately trying to say, okay, let's establish some vocational colleges, let's establish some regional banks, let's establish some form of associations for workers and business that can be part of this new arrangement after COVID. And the extraordinary thing is that, they've been more receptive in lots of ways than the church. So I'm just saying subsidiarity, status, solidarity. Yeah, we can work with this framework. In many ways, they're moving away from strict utilitarian measurement, of these things. But I guess it all comes down in the end to a genuine sense of attachment and belonging to a community in a particular place and what form that takes. Anyway, that's just my first reaction to the questions, but please, anybody.
But that doesn't surprise me.
One second.
Sorry.
Florence, just 1 second. Adam had his hand up, so I'm going to...
Yeah, I was wondering, you were saying there's no question too controversial, you're not going to cancel us. Okay, so a question I've been trying to deal with in my local Labour Party is it seems to me that Labour lost a lot of power because of the northern white working class going against them because Labour was not anti-immigration enough or so on and so forth. But if I bring this up, then my local Labour Party members Southern Labour Party members will equate anti-immigrationism with racism, and how if you're not fully in favour of free movement, then you are basically racist. How should I go about trying to combat that kind of sentiment if you think it should be combated?
Yeah, all I could say, Adam, is wow. I'll respond now, but please be in touch after, for a more extended conversation. Forgive me, Florence, you were going to say something.
No, I think that would be a really good question to answer.
No, but I'm taking a few. Give me an opportunity to reflect. So.
Oh, I was just thinking that I'm not surprised that the church haven't been receptive, because I guess it goes back to what Tom was saying about the bishops on Dom Cummings, is that relevance has been really important, and therefore when you're trying to be relevant, you're always on the back foot because you're taking your cues from someone else. And so it's like a quick look around. Is everybody in society on board? We don't want to offend anybody. And so part of that, I feel, is because the church is aware or feels politically toxic, which has not been helped by Labour, who appear to have forgotten any kind of like heritage. How can you make the Labour Party not be embarrassed about Christians?
Yeah. Well, okay. Anybody else while I mull it over?
I've got a question that's quite different to what's been spoken previously. I was just thinking about conversations that I've had with people in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like there's a sense of apathy in relation to a lot of subjects, particularly this whole thing of real relationships. And someone mentioned about churches. I know a lot of people my age that are like, oh no, I don't want to go back to an actual church. Zoom's great. I can just wake up when I want. I don't have to get dressed. I can just watch it. It's really easy. It's really simple. Another area I've noticed is just, there seems to be a lack of kind of interest when you put forward another idea. So I still don't completely believe on lockdown, but I think it's really important the fact that there should have been a debate. You know, we had a huge debate surrounding Brexit. Everyone's pushing another vote because of the economy. You know, that was the biggest thing. Thousands of jobs can be lost. But in relation to lockdown, it kind of pales into insignificance. And even just conversations surrounding the state and the role that the state has and civil liberties, freedom of speech. I almost get the sense that people think because we live in a country where we've experienced relative freedom for a long time, that's always the case. That will always be the case. But my kind of feeling is, well, actually, default position is chaos. Default position is evil. Default position is not this. This is, you have to work towards a society that functions and works well. Why? So my two questions would be: have you noticed that there's a kind of sense of apathy? And if not, or no, if you have, what would you say is the main cause behind not wanting to engage in actual real relationships, or things that potentially could be a cause for concern?
Yeah, and I think there was another thing knocking around there, Oliver, that you're concerned about erosion of liberty and freedom of speech and decline of public conversation. Did I pick that up right? Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Just adding to the mix. Yeah. So remember, I'm a politician, so I'll try and take them in order, but I'm just trying to gather my thoughts, really. Adam, I'm going to go back to Adam on this side. So essentially, just to begin the conversation, is that when Labour lost its political economy, its sense of a form of socialist economy that would have some status for workers, and kind of went in with globalization. So really boring everybody, but just to share with you, on the left we had this thing called internationalism, and internationalism was supposed to be some form of solidarity with people in other countries, other workers or oppressed people. That got dissolved into a global financial economic system. So it was never the case in previous history that freedom of movement was considered a right. It was considered something that was good for bosses because it could push down wages, undermine solidarity. But suddenly, and this, Oliver, you're on the other page, so I'm shouting to reach you there. That really comes into hate speech, closing down debate. Because what happened is I think, Adam, that Labour became completely committed to a kind of hyper-liberalism. You know, that's what it became. But if, and this relates to our church conversation, if the church is not embedded and embodied in the world, it will take a series of political positions that don't make any sense to the people who come to the community, and then the community doesn't come anymore, and the congregation doesn't come anymore. And then, Florence, you get the product output. Well, let's make the sermons better. Let's do some singing. You know, let's see if we can pull people in like that, rather than real physical presence as the body in the church, who is the congregation and is one person. To be technical about it. So Adam, what you've got is really, and that's manifest in the whole way it's gone, a real reluctance to engage with the concerns of local working class people. And then, Oliver, it becomes that if you try to raise that, you get cancelled, or you get punished, or you get labelled racist or xenophobic, when you're trying to talk about fundamental matters of political economy and belonging. So I'm just talking about this chapter that we've lived through. This globalization chapter has been traumatic. This is what I'm trying to say, and the adjustment to it has been severe, and it's depleted resources. This goes right back to the point I made to Flo, is if you look at your history as church, it's long. It's 2,000 years. There's many other chapters in that story. But because liberalism is trapped in the present now, it's always now. And because, there's no conception of sin, so everything is wicked, all of history is evil and wicked and contaminated, it's finding it difficult to draw on different resources. Obviously, I love St. Thomas of Aquinas. It doesn't make me blind to things that have happened in all those years and the complicity of some churches in those things. It's just a tradition that is fundamentally good that we could draw on and use. So essentially, what I say to Adam, we could talk about it because I can sense your kindred, but we could talk about this for hours, but I just wanted to give you a basic, that we've got to stand there and say that part of politics is to represent the interests, values, hopes, fears, and aspirations of the people that you're supposed to be in community with, and to represent, not to be a colonial force that tries to re-educate them into feeling, and look where we've got. So it's to contextualize globalization as the weird thing, and to link, as I tried to do with previous positions and traditions within Labour that aren't like that. And basically that's about politics. Politics is supposed to be about building coalitions and relationships with the people around you. It's not about being in a superior position to them. And this relates, Joanne, completely to from host to neighbour. If you can't share the joys and fears of your neighbours, you can't build these relationships. If you think, then you're still the host, you're still trying to re-educate people. And Florence, I hope you see the connection there. This is all, which you're mentioning, to be relevant and the church is there as a tribune and a witness. That's what it's there. And when it's not that, it's bad. And Oliver, I've tried to engage. I'm switching pages. Hi, Oliver. I'm trying to engage with the things you say. There is enormous amount at stake, it feels at the moment, in keeping a public culture of conversation alive. It feels like it's narrowing all the time, but it's not going to go away. What we're going to see is an even worse polarization than we witnessed under Brexit, if people can't express how they feel and can't name the things that they love and that they're proud of. And it's just something that I've learned in life that I share with you, is don't get involved in arguments on email, Twitter, not with your family, not with friends, and certainly not in politics. It's so much better if you're in a room you know, there's so much, it's so, you know, Alinsky, who founded community organising, you know, defined a liberal as someone who walked out of the room before the argument began. You know, it's this impossibility people have of holding it, and the attachments that you make to people when you meet. So, Oliver, these are strange times, but I think we've got to hold by real physical presence, you know, as something important. Relationships rather than communities of values, you know, as the way that the world is. So this is one of the weirdnesses that I can't get over. Everybody talks about diversity, but they want everybody to think the same. You know, everybody should look different but say the same thing. You know, and the idea to hold tension with others and find love in that. And precisely as you say, it can slip very easily into, you know, that's why I put China up recently, as it can go that way. It can really go that way. And just to let you know, my rabbi just sent me an email that I've just got on the covenant, so that's something to look forward to for after it's over. So Oliver, I have many things to say, but that's my initial thoughts on what you said. Please. I'm beginning to get anxious that we're going to run out of time or something, so please.
I was just going to add something about, like, because I'm kind of trained sociologically at least, this whole idea of like reciprocal relationships in society. So having social capital is a good way to build relationships, because there's two types where you build within your community. So you have the close relationships, which are kind of bonding style, and then there's the bridging social capital, which is between communities for people that you know, you've got different lifestyles, different values, but you can actually learn a lot from, and it's for the benefit of society. So you know, the research says that it's really good for our mental health, our physical health and stuff, and people tend to have better heart health, I think, or something. You know, it's just incredible, the benefits of that. But I don't know if anyone else noticed, I don't know if it's splitting hairs, but you know, the slogan of social distancing rather than physical distancing? Yeah. So when I first thought it, I heard it, I was like, but surely the physical distancing is the thing that we should be advocating. Social distancing is a terrible idea in a way, because, you know, the social bonds are the things that we're going to need to help us get through this crisis. So it's kind of been a mixed response, because I know that everybody's kind of bored of Zoom and they're always on the phones or social media all the time. But actually, you know, having these bonds, even if they're not as widespread as they need to be, which is something hopefully we can look at when we come out. Yeah. Does that make sense? It's just kind of a comment.
It really makes sense, but Bernadette, as I'll call you.
It's not Sunday, so we're all right. But,
okay. I've got things to say about that, but I'm taking them in honour of the Christian tradition. I'm taking them in threes, you know, as a nod to the Trinity.
Not sevens.
Oh. Can I just add something as well about the older generations, because I don't know about everybody's other experience, but having older people in my parish, for example, a lot of them are quite scared to come back to church, and we're looking at like opening for public private prayer and then mass, which is a bit more interactive, and people are very, very nervous. And there's that whole thing about I think Maurice, you said something about the interest of the community and the relevance, and trying to include them in the conversation while they're not there, while the kind of younger members of the parish are kind of fit and healthy and they're able to make those decisions. You know, it's keeping that everybody's common interest in mind, and trying to heal those bonds, because I know there's a lot of intergenerational tension right now. So yeah.
Along with a load of other tension. So,
yeah, one among many.
I didn't want to mention the tension. please.
Yeah, I have a different question around. You're saying this is the actually the end of the globalization.
Adam, I'm going to be vaguely authoritarian and say, if anybody who hasn't spoken yet, I'm just really keen to hear it from people. Emma, Rebecca, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think something that's really stood out to me is about like the humility of church leaders and how that, as in humility or lack of humility, and especially around these conversations. So we got an email from our like pastor in the middle of lockdown, kind of about the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and basically it was just like they were saying, you know, this is something that we haven't talked about enough, and we know we haven't, and we don't really know where to go with it, and we're on Zoom, so how are we meant to have proper conversations, and we know it'll affect people, you know, differently. And yeah, I think it was just, and then he spoke about like his experiences, and I think that just kind of, not necessarily like what we were talking about, not having formulated answers, but wanting to engage with things, but literally sending a letter to the church saying, you know, we apologize, was something that really stood out to me and was kind of like unheard of, basically. And so I think that would be one thing where the church can be, I mean, it's difficult in ways, but it's also like, it's not, we don't need this set solution, or, you know, kind of like what we're saying about the vine, you know, it's resting in Jesus and his, him giving us the wisdom as opposed to us coming up with the answers. And so I think as well, feeding into my church, especially in London, I've come from like Liverpool, where you don't really encounter a Tory, to my church in London, where, you know, there are some quite radical and different views. So I think, yeah, how the church can feed that kind of humility into those conversations. But just also in terms of like lockdown and what we were saying about churches being closed, I think at first I kind of took it as, yeah, of course, it's mass gathering, whatever. But recently I have been a little bit, especially before the more recent things came out at the weekend about churches reopening, I did think there was a particular slowness around that. And like we were talking about how we could coordinate pubs opening, even how you could have a wedding in a church, but there was no sense of how, you know, you could actually, it was almost as if, oh, you're sorted because you're on YouTube. And I did write to my MP, but they didn't respond. So yeah, I think, and almost the church, like when I've spoken about that with people from church, they're kind of, there's this real reluctance to kind of stand on anyone's toes, and it's got to be really safe, when obviously I'm not advocating for it to not be safe, but I think especially you think of like the cathedral in Liverpool, the size of it compared to all the pubs that have opened, but they're saying that they can't facilitate a church service, or there was no guidance around that, or the, you know, the liability will lie with the leader who has an elderly congregation. Just seems pretty out of order, and how the church engages in a way that's helpful and not kind of like what we were saying, you know, kind of furthering bad images of the church. Yeah.
Got it. Emma?
Yeah, just a thought around this idea of how can the church establish and maintain like relational capital within a community and a place, and how that, as you said like early on in the beginning, that it's a responsibility of the church to protect that, to protect the value of relationship and love in whatever sense within a community, and how actually that's this idea, it's kind of, as Rebecca was saying, this idea of like vulnerability might actually be really central to that. And especially like thinking about this idea of like reciprocity in serving, because when there's serving, there's always a server and a served, and with that comes a power difference, a power inequality naturally, where the server is in the position of greater power, and the receiver is in that interaction perceived to be the one of lesser power or standing. And so if the church is going to foster these relationships, perhaps there needs to be more like two-way serving of the church stepping back and not just being we're going to always give and give and give, and we're going to be seen to be the guys in the community that are the givers, but actually how there's this generosity in not always being the giver, but being the receiver, and that's a more humbling position to take.
Definitely.
So perhaps that shifting dynamic could be important in relationship building.
Yeah, and just to say before I sum up, and Adam, I will return to you, and apologies for the intervention earlier, is that's Emma, that's just it. It is, you need to be loved too. You know, you can't, that's the very nature of the reciprocity. Adam, please. I'm violating my trinity here.
Is there no one else wants to talk, like Joanne, or got a specific question? I don't want to.
I'll just say something quickly. Sorry, Adam. I was just going to say, Maurice. Yeah, one thing I've been thinking is I feel like the at least in the Church of England, there's been a real lack of leadership in terms of being present in society. Because I remember reading something about how the church isn't just meant to be a food bank or a debt advice service. It's meant to offer spiritual leadership. And it's interesting because you look at somewhere like France, throughout their lockdown, churches have always been open for private prayer. It's one of the things that has always been recognized, that actually if it's open for private prayer, there's not going to be so much of an issue with a lack of social distancing. And it makes more sense in some ways than pubs being open, like Rebecca was saying earlier. And I remember just within London, it got to the ridiculous point where it was like vicars couldn't even do an online service from within the church. They weren't allowed in their own church buildings. They had to do it in their house. So you'd have instances of a vicar moving things over from the church building into their house, like a little flat or whatever.
The vicar wasn't allowed into the church.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it got to.
Yeah, and so I think in some ways that's because there's perhaps a mindset amongst church leadership to try and make sure that we are being seen to do the right thing in terms of what is expected, but actually we're not doing so much what the church is called to do. And I found that a real disappointment. And I do wonder, like, I know there has been positive stats in terms of online services. I saw an article in The Guardian saying that there's been a 25% increase in terms of online people watching services online. And so you might have a church of 100, and 125 people are now watching that church's service online. And those are very positive things and maybe give you hope for the future in the church. But then there is also a lot of fear, and there's also, because there's now people have gotten used to this whole thing of watching it from home, you do kind of wonder if when the churches come back properly for services, whether there's going to be a massive drop in terms of people actually come into the building.
Yeah.
But that's just more a couple of points rather than a question. But I just
Thanks. Okay, I'll respond, and then maybe we can get another round in before we sum up. So I'm going to find Bernadette. There you go. I'm going to call you Bernadette just to be old-fashioned and identify with the older generation. Completely with what you're saying, and also about the physical distancing and all of that. Except you can see. So now comes the bit in the conversation where I become more difficult and abrasive. But you can see how deeply the categories of capitalism have entered when we talk about our relationship with our mum as human capital, you know, as our friendships as a form of capital, which we need to, and the bridging capital and the bond. When, you know, when I'm having these conversations in politics, they talk about natural capital when they're talking about nature, and they're, you know, like, is this to be conceptualized in terms of capital, something that we save or something that we spend, something that we invest? I'm just sharing with you that I've got a long rumbling rage about the colonization of relationships and love by metrics of measurement and saving and expenditure. And the point you make, you know, the common good is, you know, is absolutely at its heart about the the relationships between the young and the old, you know, and do we share a life with old people? And then it goes right back to what Emma was saying, you know, and do we do a good deed by visiting, or do we, you know, or do we give, but what could we learn? So just to let you know, I'm really working. So there's 40 universities that are going to go bankrupt in August. Everybody, this is going to happen. And just so you know what a bad person I am, I'm really arguing that they should be turned into vocational colleges. You know, universities to me represent absolutely the era of globalization. Everybody go to university, that's the means of social mobility. And that was a whole massive disintegration of apprenticeships, vocational education and all those things. But I was thinking, Bernadette, that we should bring the older people as teachers into these vocational colleges. You know, the people who actually know what they're doing, those ones, the ones who aren't in management. Yeah. And
is there something to do with the new university? Is it is it Hereford or something? Are they doing something like that? I think they're getting.
Well, they're beginning to smell the coffee. But what I'm saying is, the government's got no idea what, you know, no idea, no plan. So I don't think it's going to happen this year. I think they're probably, but we've got to think about, that's one of the issues, vocational colleges, local banks. So the institutional ecology, that's one of the things that's going on in there. But you can see, I hope, that the common good thinking is covenantal thinking. It's intergenerational, it's across class, it's suspicious of debt. And Rebecca, I really get, but here's a difficulty. We've got to be simultaneously humble and stubborn. You know, humility without the stubbornness doesn't, do you see what I'm saying? It doesn't, you've got to be stubborn for the possibilities of love and redemption in this world. You know, that's the goal. You see what I mean? So I get a lot of people being humble, but they're really still quite arrogant. They say, but then the real test, so, you know, just to go back to what Joanne asked me at the beginning, Blue Labour paradox, something that sounds wrong but is right, you know, so that the faith will redeem citizenship, but without faith, citizenship is a very brutal concept, or I would say that tradition is the basis of modernization. You've got to, and so humility has to be accompanied with a stubbornness, and what you're kind of drawing attention to, and Adam referred to the same issue, is that there was a sense in which the church vacated the body. It just vacated the place. It went away. It dissolved. And I think this was, and Joanne, this is a matter probably for another time, but this book, I mean, at least Catholic priests could pray in their churches. Anglican priests couldn't even pray in their church. And Tom, you're there, right? You're on my screen, great. And that was my explanation, is for the nastiness of the Twitter pylon on Dominic Cummings. You know, 90% head prefect, 10% adolescent rage. You know, that relationship to the state. Yes, we're going to be chief enforcers. We're going to completely adopt, Bernadette, not just the concept of social capital, but we're going to adopt social distancing rather than physical distancing. We're going to adopt the whole language of the state and the enforcement. But at the same time, we feel a bit humiliated, so we're going to kick out in a. So I'm just sharing with you, and this goes back to the point that I made to Florence earlier. There's a real way in which this can disintegrate. We've got to get a hold on where we are and what we're doing. And Rebecca, this concept of humility and stubbornness, that's where that's important, because there's a leadership role here for saying, look, we're all in trouble. We all need to be supported and loved. And we know that because our tradition teaches us this. You know, you have that inheritance. And Bernadette, that's just so what I do is I substitute the word capital for inheritance. So we've got a natural inheritance, we've got a social, and how that inheritance comes to all of us. And this goes back to the point I'm making to Florence. You have the most treasured inheritance, which is your Christian inheritance, which teaches you that ultimately love and faithfulness are absolutely essential parts of a good, meaningful life. And just to be really difficult, that's really countercultural at this time. It really kicks against hedonism, immediate gratification. It kicks against, you know, what you were saying, Oliver. You know, just about, well, I can just, you know, watch the service on a Zoom in my pajamas. It's quite a demanding inheritance if it's going to be upheld. And Emma, I've already said, but that I completely. So vulnerability is you've got to recognise that vulnerability. This goes back to the point I was making to Rebecca. But you also have a strength, which is your understanding that the prevailing culture is quite narcissistic, nihilistic, self-serving, contractual, and you have your covenantal obligations, but it needs to be reciprocal. So I completely got what you said earlier, Fred. I've seen a lot of interfaith work though that is not reciprocal, where one group does a huge amount of giving and sort of corrals, but there's not so when it's good, it's really good. But that reciprocity is absolutely vital. And Adam, I'm totally with you on what you said. We could talk about it more, but there was a sense where the church ceased to be a real physical presence in the places that they were. And then, and this goes back to Emma's point, really, is that then it becomes basically a welfare service, a kind of aspect of welfare, and that's not it. That, you know, that's not a loving relationship. That's a service provider relationship, and that's not the right way. And so you can see how there's a lot more to talk about in this engagement, but I hope I'm not being too difficult in this matter.
I think this has been a really, really fascinating discussion. So thank you so much, Maurice.
Oh, you see, I thought we wouldn't fill the time. Well,
there we go. I know. Love to do another round, but we're probably.
Oh dear, we haven't got time. Sorry about that.
I think just about most of us have spoken. So, and yeah, lots of food for thought there. So thank you so much. And just say thank you everyone for coming. We're thinking that we'll probably not meet in August and have a bit of a break, and then meet again in September. And we're actually going to have Angus Ritchie, who's the director of Centre for Theology and Community. He's going to talk about his book, Inclusive Populism. I think this will be quite a good carry-on from what Maurice has spoken about today. So we'll talk a bit more in depth about the methodology of community organising, and how that, he talks about the idea of fake populism that we see at the moment, and kind of authentic populism, and how community organising, particularly as it's kind of practiced through churches and faith institutions, can really enact authentic populism. And some of the stuff that we've been talking about today, how can the church really kind of build up civic sort of civil society again. So please come along to that. That will details that will be sent out, but we'll have a break for a while, and we hope that at some point in the next couple of months we can meet up again in person. So watch this space, and I think a few of you are not in our WhatsApp group, so we will add you to that if you'd like to be. And Maurice, are you happy for your email address to be shared?
Completely, and I'm going to completely violate my prerogatives by just that was a really lovely experience, and thank you. It was really good for me to be able to talk about these things, so I really appreciate it. Adam, be in touch on that, on that stuff, but any of you've got my email, and it's been lovely to meet you virtually, and I hope in better times we can real physical presence can be expressed, and we can continue the conversation. But I just bless you all and good luck to you all. Don't forget to be humble and stubborn in everything you do in equal measure.
Absolutely. Oh,
and Florence, be in touch, please.